If you walked into a clothing store in much of the Western world in the year 1900 and asked for something appropriately girly, the shop assistant might have handed you something pink. And if you asked for something suitably boyish, you'd have walked out with something blue. That's not a typo, and it's not a joke. For a huge stretch of recent history, the exact opposite of what most of the world considers normal today was the accepted rule. So how did an entire planet end up flipping this to the point where getting it wrong today can genuinely upset people at a baby shower? Today we're tracing the surprisingly recent, surprisingly arbitrary, and surprisingly commercial story of how pink and blue became gendered colors at all, starting from ancient civilizations and ending with the multi-billion-dollar industry built entirely around two shades of dye. Before pink or blue ever had anything to do with boys or girls, color itself already carried enormous cultural weight across civilizations, just not in the way you'd expect. In ancient Egypt, color was deeply tied to religion and status rather than gender. Blue, made from a rare and expensive pigment, was associated with the heavens, the Nile, and divinity, and was considered so precious that it was often reserved for depicting gods and pharaohs. In ancient Rome, purple, not pink or blue, was the color that mattered most, reserved almost exclusively for emperors and the elite, because the dye itself was so labor-intensive to produce that ordinary citizens simply couldn't afford it. In parts of ancient China, red carried the strongest symbolic weight, associated with luck, celebration, and protection, a meaning that still strongly persists today, especially around weddings and Lunar New Year celebrations. Notice that in none of these civilizations was pink or blue treated as inherently masculine or feminine. Color symbolism existed everywhere, but it revolved around class, religion, spirituality, and luck, not the gender of a baby. That idea, as strange as it sounds today, is a remarkably recent invention. For centuries, across much of Europe and later in European colonies around the world, young children weren't dressed by gender using color at all, because early childhood clothing wasn't really designed around gender in the first place. Historical records and surviving portraits from the 1600s through the 1800s show that both boys and girls were commonly dressed in simple white dresses well into early childhood, sometimes as late as 6 or 7 years old. This wasn't a fashion choice, it was pure practicality. White fabric could be boiled and bleached repeatedly, which mattered enormously in an era without modern washing machines, when small children were constantly getting sick, spilling things, or having accidents on their clothing. Durability and ease of cleaning mattered far more than color-coded identity. On top of that, young children of both genders typically had long hair during these early years, meaning that from a distance, in old family portraits, it's often genuinely difficult to tell which children were boys and which were girls at all. This wasn't considered strange at the time. Early childhood simply wasn't treated as a period where gender needed to be visually broadcast to strangers on the street. That entire concept had to be invented later. By the mid-1800s, thanks to advances in synthetic dye chemistry, pastel colors like soft pink, light blue, pale yellow, and mint green became widely available and increasingly fashionable for children's clothing across parts of Europe and North America. But here's the important detail almost everyone gets wrong. These pastel colors were not initially assigned to specific genders at all. Both boys and girls were dressed in the full range of pastels, largely based on personal or family preference. Not any kind of standardized gendered system. If anything, some retailers even suggested wildly different logic entirely, recommending certain colors based on a baby's hair color or eye color rather than their sex. This is where the story takes the turn that surprises almost everyone. As clothing manufacturers began experimenting with gender-specific marketing in the early 1900s, a rule started emerging in trade publications and department stores, and it was the exact opposite of what we consider standard today. In June of 1918, an American trade publication for infant clothing explicitly stated that the generally accepted rule at the time was pink for boys and blue for girls. The reasoning given was genuinely fascinating by modern standards. Pink was considered a stronger, more decided color, and was therefore seen as more appropriate for boys, while blue was considered more delicate and dainty, making it the preferred choice for girls. Pink's association with red, a bold and traditionally strong color, reinforced this logic, while blue's long-standing association with the Virgin Mary in European religious art gave it a softer, more graceful connotation that was considered fitting for girls. By 1927, this wasn't just a fringe opinion. Time magazine published a chart surveying major department stores across the United States, and multiple prominent retailers, including well-known stores in Boston, New York, and Chicago, were recommending pink specifically for boys. This wasn't an isolated quirky opinion, it was, for a significant stretch of the early 20th century, treated as a widely accepted convention among people whose entire job was to understand what parents wanted to buy. It's worth pausing here because this wasn't simply a case of one publication being wrong while everyone else already knew the correct pink for girls answer. Genuine confusion existed across the industry for decades. Some retailers pushed pink for boys and blue for girls. Others did the complete opposite. Some stores sidestepped gender entirely and marketed colors based on other factors, like hair color or eye color, or treating a baby's sex as almost irrelevant to which pastel shade you should buy them. This lack of consensus lasted for roughly half a century, from around the 1880s through the 1930s, without any single dominant standard taking hold across the industry. If you'd asked 10 different clothing manufacturers in 1920 which color was correct for a baby girl, you could plausibly have gotten several different answers, and none of them would have been considered outrageous at the time. So if there was this much genuine disagreement and inconsistency, how do we end up with today's rigid, near-universal standard of pink for girls and blue for boys? The honest answer is less romantic than most people expect. It was largely driven by consumer marketing, not any deep cultural or scientific reasoning. By the 1940s, in the period following the Second World War, and during the post-war baby boom, manufacturers and retailers began converging on a single standardized system, primarily because it was commercially convenient. If parents believed that boys and girls needed distinctly different colored clothing, that meant families with multiple children of different genders needed to buy separate wardrobes instead of reusing hand-me-downs. This wasn't some grand ideological plan. It was a practical, profitable byproduct of the post-war consumer boom, when manufacturing capacity was expanding rapidly and retailers were eager to sell as much distinctly marketed clothing as possible to a growing generation of new parents. Once major manufacturers and stores began consistently marketing pink specifically toward girls and blue specifically toward boys, the baby boomer generation became the first generation raised almost entirely within this now familiar color-coded system. And because an entire generation grew up inside this convention, their own cultural expectations solidified around it, reinforcing the pattern for their children and their children's children after that. Here's where this story becomes genuinely interesting rather than just a piece of trivia. Once this color-coding system became dominant in major Western manufacturing and retail markets, particularly the United States, it didn't stay contained there. Global manufacturing, international media, and Western-dominated marketing throughout the mid to late 20th century meant that this specific color convention spread far beyond its country of origin, becoming deeply embedded in toy design, clothing lines, greeting cards, and children's media across large parts of the world, regardless of whether any of those individual cultures had their own pre-existing color traditions for gender at all. This is a powerful example of how a single, fairly arbitrary marketing decision made by a relatively small number of mid-20th century manufacturers and department stores could ripple outward and eventually feel like a deep, almost biological truth to billions of people worldwide, most of whom have absolutely no idea this convention is barely a century old. Fast forward to today, and this once arbitrary color system has evolved into something the manufacturers of the 1940s could never have imagined. An entire industry built around the moment parents-to-be discover their baby's sex. Thanks to modern prenatal ultrasound technology and genetic testing, parents can now learn a baby's biological sex months before birth, something that simply wasn't possible for the vast majority of human history. This medical capability directly gave rise to the modern gender reveal party, an event built almost entirely around the dramatic unveiling of either pink or blue, whether through cake filling, balloons, colored powder, or increasingly elaborate and sometimes even dangerous pyrotechnic displays. It's a striking full-circle moment when you think about it. A marketing decision made by department stores roughly 100 years ago has evolved into an entire globally recognized cultural ritual, complete with its own party supplies industry, social media trend cycles, and even, in some widely reported extreme cases, actual wildfires caused by reveal events gone wrong. Here's the detail that puts the entire story in perspective. This isn't an ancient tradition stretching back centuries. It isn't rooted in any deep biological or scientific reasoning about which color genuinely suits which sex. The pink for girls, blue for boys convention that so many people today treat as an unquestionable, almost natural law is, historically speaking, barely 3 or 4 generations old, and for a meaningful chunk of the 20th century, it was confidently believed to work the exact opposite way. If you traveled back in time to the 1910s and dressed a baby boy in pink, you wouldn't have been going against convention. You'd have been following it perfectly. What's genuinely fascinating about this story isn't just the pink and blue reversal itself, it's how quickly an entirely commercially invented convention can become so deeply culturally embedded that people mistake it for something ancient, natural, or even instinctive. Something that was, for decades, a genuine toss-up between competing marketing opinions eventually hardened into a rule so rigid that violating it today, Dressing a baby boy in pink, for example, can still draw surprised reactions or unsolicited comments from total strangers. This is a pattern worth remembering the next time you encounter a rule that feels timeless and obvious. Sometimes, the things that feel most natural to us are actually the most recent and the most arbitrary decisions in disguise. So the next time you walk past a baby shower with its perfectly coordinated pink or blue decorations, or scroll past yet another elaborate gender reveal video online, remember that you're looking at the end result of a fairly recent, fairly random marketing decision, one that could have just as easily gone the other way, and for decades, actually did. Every color, every custom, every obvious rule you've never questioned has a hidden history like this one. We break down another one every episode, so if this kind of thing fascinates you as much as it fascinates us, stick around.